Everybody make sure your mic's on. And for those of you that tend to sit back in your chairs, make sure you talk into the microphones, please. All right?
I'll try.
All right, I'd like to call this meeting of the Oxford Planning and Zoning Commission to order at 7:05 PM. First order of business will be the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Roll call, please.
Sarah Locke.
Joshua Dykstra.
Pizza Brass.
Pat Gonzalez.
Carl Bouchard.
Jason Swan.
Jessica Pennell.
Kevin McSherry.
Okay. First order of business is continued public hearing Z-25-004, proposed text amendment to Article 5, Section 5.3.2B and C of the Oxford zoning regulations. Owner and applicant, Rosato Custom Homes and Remodelers LLC, 671 Oxford Road, Oxford, Connecticut. Attorney Dominic Thomas, 315 Main Street, Derby, Connecticut. Good evening, Dominic.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Attorney Dominic Thomas, Cohen and Thomas, 315 Main Street, Derby, Connecticut. What you all have before you is, I often do this when there are public hearings that get continued. I made a packet of the revised text amendment and then the exhibits, including the last item, one of the items, which I derived from the certain documentation that was presented by one of the commissioners. I was provided with the copies of it, and I was able to review it, and I'm presenting that to you tonight as part of the packet. But what I'd like to begin with, and I want to clarify something, and I want to make sure that everybody's on the same page, because there was a comment made sort of related to this. And it was one of the motivations of why I did some of the changes to the my proposed regulation. Keep in mind that the way this is written, the way your regulation is written, 5.3.2, A, B, C, D, and E, all pertain to the boarding of horses. That's all it pertains to. Because A, B, C, D, and E are governed by the sentence introducing it. And it says, this is under special exceptions, boarding of horses may be permitted for commercial purpose subject to the following requirement. So I want to make it clear that we are not talking about here somebody who has a horse, per se, a horse farm where they don't board. That technically would not come under this. Somebody who has their own horses, I don't know, horse racing, because your regulation, and somebody pointed this out at one point at the very first public hearing, they said, if we're talking, I think it was one of the commission members also, and said, if you're talking about, we're talking about boarding of horses, why do we have this stuff about cattle, sheep, and pigs? Okay. However, in order to address the concern that might occur in my regulation, in my proposed draft, we'll note that in section B, it talks about the fact that you are to, and I'll get to this in more detail, you are to analyze the number of horses subject to the special exception considerations, which I will go over again. I went over them once, as may be amended, and subject to all other livestock that is kept on the premises. So you can analyze it if somebody is boarding horses but also has other livestock on the premises. You can address the concern and put restrictions on it. So that is one of the reasons I wanted to point that out and make it clear that that's what we are talking about. Now, in the packet that I gave you after the proposed reg, just to, refresh you, and I did two-side it so we wouldn't cut down any extra trees, is the POCD that I presented to you. Because whenever somebody presents, as I did at the very first meeting, when somebody presents this, you have to try to connect it to the POCD, which is an advisory document. And preserving agricultural resources, preserving farming and boarding. Excuse me. Is that me? No.
Sorry.
You're supposed to do that at the appropriate time. No, anyway, they talk about the rural characteristics, and even boarding of horses is obviously a rural character. So I presented that to you, and I just wanted to remind you of it. Next, and I think this is where the next two items tie together. I presented you with that handwritten letter from Rhonda Alfano, who's been in the business of horses for over 40 years, I think she says there. She ran a farm, and she talks about what they did on the 6.7 acres of Spring Meadow Farm in Milford, which she ran for 46 years. And she talked about that the focus is on how you're taking care of the horses and what you do, not necessarily the issue of how large it is. And she talks about cleaning the paddocks and doing that nature. So they had the boarding of horses, plus they had horses for therapeutic use and everything of that nature. And then there was the information about Spring Meadow Farm. So now, what I was presented with after the meeting, because these were introduced at the last meeting, and your attorney, Attorney McSherry, was kind enough to, I believe, email them to me after it was over with. And there were two items, but the key one was the a publication of the Connecticut Resource of Conservation and Development Area Guidance for Municipality, Zoning Regulations for Livestock Best Practice, with a gorgeous picture of the two cows staring at you. Now, this was obviously extremely enlightening, and I've highlighted some of the things. But this segues very well with what Ms. Alfonso said in her letter, and an experienced person. And I've highlighted a few of the things. You're obviously welcome to read it in detail. I hope you have. It was submitted, I think, by one of the commissioners or someone as an exhibit. Regulation should not focus on acreage needs or animal units. Now, in relation to that, the thing is, do you pasture them or do you feed them inside? And if you read this, you will see that it's really what you should be focusing on is how the property is set up, not the size of the property. There are issues you need to address, but how the property is set up. And in going through it, I did make a couple more phone calls. And one of the phone calls was very interesting. It was to someone that had been referred to me, who was actually the daughter of a lawyer from Milford that I've known for years. And I didn't realize that she grew up in Woodbridge. And she's now in North Carolina. And she does come back. Her father lives in Woodbridge also, and I do. And I have driven by this certain property in Woodbridge. It is just down from Town Hall, just past Our Lady of the Assumption Church on the right. And I think it's a historic home. And in it, they have a small farm area. And she said to me, "Do you remember the paddock that they had there? And there would be horses in the corral." And she said, "Yes." And she used to apparently work there or whatever, or visit there. And she said that if you pasture horses, when you're pasturing them, if you don't have pastures that are very large, a very large farm like she has down in, she work or runs or whatever she does in North Carolina, where they rotate the horses from pasture to pasture. She said, if you have a smaller one and you put them out there, and there are many farms, all you would have is a dirt thing with one. They will completely consume all the grass. And that isn't what they're supposed to be fed. They're supposed to be fed the hay and everything like that. He said, so that is a situation where people make a mistake. And she was referring to even somebody that would go out and buy one horse and keep it on their property. And if they don't do it properly, then all they do is eat the grass, and the grass is gone, and it just never comes back. And it becomes a dirt or mud pile, and that's not good for them. That's what she was explaining to me. And she was doing and explaining this to me after I read this, and it made sense what she was saying. It talks about the fact, and it says here, and I will read it for the record, animal density formulas were originally based on a pasture yield needed to support the animal's nutrient needs. They were not intended to be used in municipal zoning regulations. Animal density formulas do not consider modern feeding and husbandry methods, including rotational grazing, measured feed rations grown off-site, manure management, and techniques and dedicated exercise programs. To address animal density issues, one needs to consider the management practices in place that reduce nuisances and provide for a healthy environment for the animal regardless of density. And this is, of course, coming from the state of Connecticut. Now, you can then go to the next page where they talk about pasturing requirements, and they talk about pasturing is not always necessary. If zero pasturing is practiced, the livestock owner will have to adequately purchase feed. So there are requirements that the person would have to do, and have an exercise yard and a sound plan for stormwater and manure management. Recommendation, zoning regulations for the raising of livestock should focus on setbacks, buffers, and site suitability to minimize impact to the environment and adjacent properties. In moderate to high density residential areas, it may be prudent to restrict the agricultural and farm use to some extent. In those areas, a permit for livestock should be considered to enable site-specific review and potentially allow livestock where it can be demonstrated to be appropriate, sometimes with conditions. Okay? So I think this provides the outline. So, and then it goes on, there's more stuff to read. I'm not going to review everything for you. Again, this was given to me for the commission. It talks about setbacks, buffers. You know, it's interesting. They say agricultural buffer for new residents, a 100-foot agricultural buffer is required where new residence is proposed adjacent to agricultural land. And I've dealt this. I've dealt this when I represented a large farming entity in Shelton, and where they needed an agricultural buffer from a subdivision that was going in. So you get to look at the site and you get to address it from the site, okay? It is important, then it goes on to say that setbacks are not treated as a zero activity buffer. A building setback should not be a hinder to the movement of animals up to the property line. So how do you accomplish all that? Well, let's go back and analyze the regulation and how someone would file an application under your regulation. So in it, number one, I've put a number, 10,000 square feet. You could literally say, we're not going to put a number in there, we're just going to do it as a commission. We're just going to allow a density, we're going to require a minimum of 5 acres for boarding. Remember, this is for boarding. And then you have to come to us and show us how many animals in your special exception application. Remember, this does not create a site plan permitted use as of right, it's for special exception. All right, and there are, it references directly to Article 10, and it references another issue that you have here if you're keeping other livestock as a condition. Then you go to C. In C, the commission will reduce the 100-foot setback for a pen. I left it in. But when you read that agricultural thing from the state, that is almost saying that no building pen or run shall be used shall be located closer than 100 feet. And when you read that, the state is saying you really shouldn't limit it to pen and run. Building maybe. And we have no issue that can stay in there. But pen and run, and you notice that it talked about, when I just said to you, is you shouldn't interfere with their activity going up to the property line where appropriate. So remember, this is not, is there one of the packets for Commissioner Wall?
Sorry, I'm
All right, I didn't know whether I have a packet of all the exhibits, and I'm going through them now. Okay. These are all the exhibits. So when you look at that direction, the direction from the Connecticut Department of Agriculture and the state of Connecticut on what your zoning should be, in looking at how this fits together, my suggested change is the commission may reduce the setback for a pen or run, not for a building, for a pen or run, when it determines that the topography, abutting property uses, or existing natural buffers are such as to mitigate the adverse effects. So I'm going to take a little credit here, without me ever having read the thing from the state, that is basically what they're saying. You you do site-specific zoning. Then what you look at, because I reference it right there, this is a special exception. The last thing here is under section 10, you have the discretion, the courts have said this clearly, to analyze the site. What is next to the site? Is there another farm next to the site? What road is the site on? What is the topography next to it? Is the topography level? Is the topography where the adjacent properties or uses are well above it? All of that stuff can be analyzed. And when you look at section 10.3, the items in section 10.3, you can see are almost referenced in the zoning regulations for livestock best practices and a guidance to livestock farming. A lot of them are referenced in here in a different fashion. It tells you that you need to consider the area. You need to consider whether it's a medium density, higher density residential area, which means you also consider if it's a lower density area. Is it a farming area? All of these things are in the guidance from the state, but they are also in your own regulations, which say in 10.3 that you're allowed to determine that the proposed use, buildings, or structures will not be detrimental to the health, safety, and welfare and property values of the neighborhood, that the site will be suitably landscaped, that's buffers or anything, and suitable setbacks, and the lot on which the use, building, or other structure is proposed to be established is of adequate dimensions to permit construction of facilities and the conduct of the use. That is exactly what is being said in the recommendations. So therefore, keeping in mind that 5.3.2, as I have drafted it, made it with amended, it makes it very clear that this is pertaining to the boarding of horses. That is it. As a matter of fact, the way it's written right now, you don't really have a regulation, and you certainly should consult with your counsel on this, to deal with a farm that has livestock, because this one deals solely with boarding of horses. And so I do believe that this regulation can be approved. I believe it has enough protections, and it grants the protections. I believe it has enough control under the special exception. I believe it clears up the incongruities and the confusion in the regulation that it now exists, and it certainly fits along with the expertise you've been presented with. The letter from Rhonda Alfonso, which is supported by the advice and recommendations and the guidance from the Department of Agriculture with respect to livestock. So thank you very much, and I'll answer any questions on it.
have a question for the applicant's representative? Anyone? Okay, in that case, then I'll go out in the audience. Is there anyone in the public that wishes to speak to this application, either for or against, or just make a comment? Is there anyone in the audience that wishes to speak to this application? Is there anyone in the audience that wishes to speak to this application? Hearing none, back to the commission. Anyone? Anybody has anything? Okay, then I will entertain a motion. Okay,
You wanna? All right. I'll make a motion to close the public hearing for Z-25004.
do I have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstained? Motion carries. Thank you. We got a couple minutes until we can start our regular meeting.